Hello. Hi. Hello. Hello. We're gonna get started.
Hey everyone.
Hey. Sorry. We're gonna get started, and we are not trying to turn on the heater because it kind of interrupts the recording. So, sorry about that. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, so hi, welcome to the Member Series Night. For those of you who are not familiar, Member Series is a public event at Green where resident members, mostly grad students, share their research or some interesting topics in their field. Today we have Zach as a speaker. Zach is a JD candidate at the Allard School of Law at UBC. Zach is an artist and a scholar who hopes to build more solidarity and advance anti-racist and decolonial framework. Today, he will talk about the bounds and limits of theoretical storytelling for human rights advocacy. With that, I'll leave the floor to Zach.
All right, hi everyone. Thank you all for being here, and I just want to give a quick acknowledgement that we are on the unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And also, before I begin this presentation, I should say that it has a lot to do with the social studies about theater. It is about theater. It's also very nerdy. It's a very nerdy presentation. But if any of you dare call me a theater nerd, that is what? Homophobic. And I would have no choice, absolutely no choice, but to what? Cancel you. And I can smell the cancellation just coming, so just we're all aware before I begin. All right. So, sorry, I pressed. So what I really want to start with is talking about story. Story is very powerful, and it's an innately human thing. It means something to be able to construct a narrative, and it is embedded into the very daily structure of our lives. It's in our gossip. It's how we relate to each other. It's in our entertainment. It's a very profound thing of what it means to be human, this idea of story. But it's also particular to people who have experienced dispossession. And so here, in the words of almost every second-wave feminist, I'm going to talk about myself because the personal is political. And then for many of you, you're already aware, I have a mixed background. My mother is Palestinian, and my grandfather was a Palestinian refugee. In 1948, my grandfather had to flee persecution in what Palestinians collectively refer to as Nakba, which means the catastrophe in Arabic, as they were forcibly dispelled from their homes and villages as they were being bombed to make way for what is now the state of Israel. In the process of dispossession, people like my grandfather lost things like their formal documents, and communities lose things like their archives, their museums, their artifacts, their histories. Things that are tangible, physical pieces of storytelling become lost. And, personally, you lose a lot of things that mean a lot to yourself that are also part of these tangible storytelling pieces. My grandfather's family, they lost all access to their photographs. My grandfather has no photographs from this time before he had to flee. We lost things like, our family heirlooms, our clothes, those things of our childhood. So all of these physical pieces of storytelling that we see in museums nowadays is lost on refugee populations like with my grandfather. And so what my grandfather always told me about this process and losing and being dispossessed, he still says that there's something that he was still able to carry two things. And one of those, he said, I always had my education and my capacity to learn. My grandfather was a big advocate for lifelong learning and something that's a very deeply entrenched value in my family. But the other thing he always said is that I always had my voice. Whatever happened to me, I always had my ability to narrate what was happening to me, what was happening in my life, and to tell people my story. And that's something that means a lot to my community, to the Palestinian community, to other communities that have been dispossessed. Oral history is so important to Palestinians. It is because it is now one of the only mechanisms by which we have an ability to tell our history. And this is evidenced by the ongoing scholarship on Palestinian history. Scholars like Nahla Abdu, who's at the University of Ottawa, and Danya Allen, who's at McGill, have specialized in the oral history of Palestinians, because this is now the only mechanism that we have to learn about us and our past. But we can also talk about how this matters to other groups, how story matters to other groups, and how oral story matters to other groups. Things like formal documentation of history, like those records about who's been where, who matters, your family members, that's all kind of a top-down state initiative, and that speaks to power and authority. So when we think about Black enslaved people in North America, they were not documented in terms of where they came from, who their families were, their relationships with each other. Those were things that were not formally documented by colonial states as they were through the transatlantic slave process. And it meant the destruction and loss of, and it also meant the destruction and loss of things like diaries and personal writings of these enslaved people who had to keep those things in hiding. And we can also similarly talk about the process of settler colonialism here on Turtle Island. And it's one in which traditional and historical items, cultural sites, and land are also all similarly destroyed. And places of artifact, of significance, of sacredness are deteriorated. In Indigenous and Black histories, just like with my grandfather as a refugee, there's a certain significance to oral storytelling. And obviously, these different groups carry different cultural weight and meaning to what oral history means. But there's a particular weight in light of systemic violence and dispossession for what the story means. It is a reassertion of one's humanity and is one of the things that can never truly be taken from a community despite entrenched systemic violence. In light of these horrible atrocities, we still find that these stories have a way of coming through, because at the end of the day, they cannot take away our stories. So a lot of my research on storytelling and theater kind of begins with Tisri Dunya theater, and particularly in relation to how I talk about this topic in relation to social justice. Tisri Dunya Theater is a company founded in Montreal, Quebec, and somewhere around the 1983 mark. It was founded by Rahul Varma. Tisri Dunya Theater translates roughly in Hindi to Third World Theater, and it was meant to be a mechanism to hear the voices of the voiceless. The company's mandate is change the world one play at a time, and they have sought to truly highlight the theatrical voices of immigrants, Muslims, Black and Indigenous peoples, feminists, and queer playwrights and artists from across Canada. I was hired by this company as an intern in 2019. This was my first undergrad year, so I was truly a baby and did not know anything. And my research focused on two particular things as I was working for them. First, I was looking at Arab voices in English language theater. So I was looking at how Arabs are treated as subjects in theatrical storytelling in North America. And that's not the topic that I'm going to be telling you about tonight. The other topic that I looked at was the use of community theater for the purposes of social mobilization. How do we mobilize people to act for social justice through storytelling? I've also worked very closely with the company since then on a lot of projects, both in terms of grassroots activism, community building, and research. This talk in particular is based on a co-workshop that I ran with the company's founder, Rahul Varma. We were able to speak at the Charter at 40 conference at the University of Alberta, and the topic of our workshop was theater and the stage as a mechanism to advance human rights interests. The following is a kind of art map that an artist hired by the conference designed based on our talk. I really enjoy it. It's very fun. I particularly enjoyed the thing where I call so-called Canada. I was like, wow, they really dug into that. Yeah. So based off of my work with Tisri Dunya, I had conducted an independent project based off of my research with them. So this project, my goal was to research and learn into the question of how theater can be used for social mobilization and what are the limits of this. And as you can see from my title, the interstices, intersections, and relations of art, theater, and politics, I decided to choose a title that is incredibly pretentious. I was 19. Did I know what interstices meant? No. Did I think it looked really cool on a title of an independent project? Yes, I did. So the idea I had was to conduct qualitative interviews and write a research paper based off of these interviews that I had with Montreal-based artists. And my supervisor at the time was Khalid Madani. Under Madani's guidance, I had gone through the formal ethics review process at McGill. And side note, ethics review is not a friendly process when you're an undergraduate. They don't expect you to be there. They think you're going to either be a graduate student or a faculty. They're kind of like, throughout the whole thing, they're like, why are you here? And I was like, I don't know why I'm here, I just am. But luckily I was able to get ethics approval for these interviews, which was very important because I was mostly speaking with artists who were coming from marginalized backgrounds. And so it was really important to me that we had a trauma-informed approach that was approved of by the university for how we conducted these interviews. So yay, I get to do the interviews. So I had organized interviews with multiple Montreal-based artists, mainly ones who had previously worked with Tisseré d'Union Theatre, just because that was the network of artists that I was able to contact. And I had a wide range of artists. I had ones who were still based in Montreal, ones that were in Toronto. I had ones who had worked as playwrights, others as producers, directors, actors. I had set up semi-formal interviews with each of them where I asked them questions pertaining to how they viewed the political salience of the work, and particularly probing into why they do what they do. Why do you want people to see your play, and what do you want them to take away from it? I had to code and transcribe all of these interviews, which was a lot of busy work, but it was busy work I put on myself, so I have no one else to blame. And in the end, I used a mixed methods approach combining qualitative and quantitative data and analysis of these personal interviews to find common themes and how these artists viewed their work. So let's kind of get into what some of these themes were. So across the board, dialogue was the most commonly identified reasoning for these artists and why they did what they did. The idea of their work was to spark conversation both between the artists and the public, but also within the public themselves. The way I identified this theme was when the artist told me something like, I want the audience to leave with thinking a little differently tonight, thinking a little bit differently about this topic than when they first came in. I want them to start talking about climate change, or about immigration, or about decolonization, or in new ways, or even just think about it new. Dialogue in this sense speaks both to engaging conversations and topics, but also redirecting the tone and understanding how we engage certain social issues. The next kind of common theme I noticed was this awareness of the status quo and of system justification through storytelling. And here I'm going to talk about politics in theater, because the artists had a very distinct kind of debate amongst themselves, not formally because they weren't talking with each other, but there was kind of two factions that I kind of found about why they viewed their work as political. So there was a faction that saw that all storytelling, no matter what you say, no matter who's saying that story, every single story is political. No matter what. And so to piece this together to kind of break it down, take a classic love story. A rom-com between a man and a woman. Now, at first glance, this may seem very apolitical. It's not trying to say anything. And maybe it could be made political if, say, the woman, the heroine, was a feminist, or it's an interracial couple. Suddenly, then it becomes political. But even if we just take a standard romantic comedy, a story about a white, cisgender, heterosexual couple, there's something about that is still political, in that it is affirming certain biases we have. The artist that took the stance that everything is political, for that such a story would be innately political because the audience may not even be conscious of it, but it is a standardization of heteronormativity. It is a standardization of the salience of whose love is deemed more worthy of celebration, more worthy of being told, and more worthy of being seen. In other words, the stories can be innately political, even if we're not conscious of it, by upholding system and justification. Now, other artists differed from this view, and they've posited that a story only becomes political when it is actively conscious of the power structures at hand, and it actively defies them. In this sense, a political story is one that defies the loss of dignity, or one that rejects the very premise of system justification, one that defies the norm. In either case, however, it becomes apparent that the politically engaged artist is someone who thinks about how their stories interact with the status quo, whether or not they are defying or upholding system justification, how they are challenging something, or how they fall into the system itself. Finally, this was a particularly interesting artistic choice that was a common theme amongst my artists: non-didactic storytelling. Storytelling that doesn't have a lesson, that doesn't have a moral, that's not trying to teach you something. And this is an artistic choice, and I should kind of premise the fact that the artists that I was speaking with, this is a particular subgroup of artists. They're all based in Montreal or were based in Montreal. They're primarily all of my marginalized backgrounds. And they've all worked with the same company, Tisseré Dunia Theatre. So it's not like I'm speaking for all artists in this, but still I think it's really interesting that this was the kind of way that these artists chose to engage their audiences. And it tells something about the messages that they want to give. It's not about teaching the audience a particular singular resounding truth about a matter. Instead, it was to present the story and the complexities of a topic in their nuances and their hardships in full. This is not to say that the artists didn't want theatergoers to come away with certain things or certain points. In fact, many of them said, I want them to come away thinking that climate change is important, or, that not enough is being done about decolonization, or that we're not hearing Black voices enough. Those are things that they want people to take away. But it's more so that they do not want to dictate how the audience feels about a topic, and they don't want to push any particular policy proposal. Instead, they just want to emphasize unheard voices and underscore the need to hear such voices as we think about these topics. So based on all this, I want to return to the mandate of Tisseré Dunia Theatre. Change the world one play at a time. And this speaks to the role of storytelling in theatre in an agenda-setting role. Theatre can have a dual job in this kind of idea of agenda setting. One is to build community, and when we talk about spectacle, it is a very community-involved process. In a Western theatre model, you need to get people together. You need the costume designers. You need the people who sell the tickets. You need the director, the lighting specialist. And suddenly you're bringing all these people into a work environment that are now thinking about this topic and are now engaging with it. But also agenda sets for the very same reason that dialogue was so important to these artists. It puts certain topics up for conversation. It puts them on the agenda, and in doing so, it primes those social concerns as important matters for all who engage with the spectacle and listen to the story. This kind of gets into a new question about whose stories matter. Most of the artists I spoke to agreed that you don't have to be of any particular background to tell a story. I think we can all agree on that. But they also said that you don't need to be of any particular background to tell stories that involve anyone of any background. One artist that I spoke with, her name was Deborah Ford, and just as a side note, she was my favorite person to interview. I loved all my interviews, but I consistently got to interview her throughout the years, and she's just my favorite person to interview, because she is not only so smart and insightful, but she is the funniest person you will ever talk to. But at the time, when I was interviewing her for my project, she was working on a play about Islamophobia. And she herself is not a Muslim person, but she saw the similarities in her own experiences and that of anti-Black racism. And anti-Muslim racism, sorry. And she worked as part of and in this process of storytelling, she saw herself as a part of a larger team in which she was working with many Muslim artists. And so even though that she saw herself as a character, as a particular player in this role, she still saw it as pertinent that she did her due diligence, and her job was to be ready to learn from her Muslim colleagues. She had also stated to me, for me, the first goal of what I do is to give this marginalized person back his true story. And that is political enough for me to be engaged. But while it is true that anyone can tell a story, not all voices are equal in telling those stories. In writing for Alt Theatre magazine, I had done research on English language plays that discussed Palestine-Israel, and I don't want to go heavily into that topic tonight, but I do think it's important to note some of the things I discovered in my research. The majority and most popular plays about Palestine-Israel in the English language, and there's a good number of them, about 20 or so, probably a bit more, are all written by white playwrights. The ones that you will look up online are all written by white playwrights. And moreover, in the majority of these productions, Palestinians are never on stage. There is no Palestinian character, there's no Palestinian representation. And this is true on both accounts, whether the play is pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. It is true whether it is taking a stance that is sympathetic to Palestinians or sympathetic to Israelis. So when you don't have someone physically represented on stage, it is a practice that is theoretically and symbolically othering. And it told audience members, North American audience members, that they can engage in a theatrical storytelling process that talks about Palestinian realities without actually hearing Palestinian voices. This was the case with Tony Award-winning play Oslo, Via Dolorosa, Reading Hebron, and even the play My Name is Rachel Corrie. It also speaks to a phenomenon where certain voices are seen as more impartial, as more trustworthy, and as more deserving of being heard over others. Of course, I do want to say that there are many Palestinian playwrights and artists who work in the English language. This includes Sama Sabawi and Rima Jabr, who I've had the opportunity to work with both of them in the past, as well as Amr Nazir Zuabi. These are artists whose work has been performed across the world in Canada, New York, London, Australia, and they all are not only Palestinian-led stories, but they actually depict Palestinian people on stage. But if you were to look up on Google right now, if you were to look up on Wikipedia right now, Palestine-Israel play, none of their names come up. Instead, you get a list of plays, again, all written by white playwrights. I now want to kind of end off talking about the limits of theatrical storytelling. So space and geography. In order to have a play, you need the ability to congregate together in a particular space. This is both for the artist to be able to rehearse and put on a spectacle, but also for the audience. You need people to congregate into a particular space in order to view the spectacle, in order to view the play. And this demands that you are accorded the rights to land and use of land to do this. And this is obviously not a right accorded to all people equally. And another thing that you need, and related to space and geography, is mobility. Not only do you need the space to congregate together, but you need the right to mobility, the freedom to move to that place, to engage with these stories. And then, of course, in the age of social media, we have been able to break down some more barriers so that this mobility requirement for storytelling in general is not required, but it is certainly needed in every case of theatrical storytelling. When I think about groups like Palestinians who are segregated into refugee camps and who have severe mobility restrictions, whether they're in occupied Palestine or refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, they have to go through checkpoints, borders. These are things that prevent them from being able to congregate and view storytelling in this way. We can also talk about finance and resources. You know, when we talk about the arts, this is always a concern. It's always something that caps the true power of arts. But it also speaks to which stories get told. You know, when we're talking about whose stories are going to be financed, we're really talking about a capitalist mass appeal. You know, there's something about what theater companies, what network television says about what kind of plays they think are going to make them money, that are going to bring them capital, and what stories are really going to bring in that mass appeal. And that limits who is able to come to the floor. It's also important to note intergenerational trauma as a general inhibitor of those who are dispossessed and oppressed in their storytelling. Refugees, residential school survivors, enslaved people, genocide survivors. These are all people who, both at an individual psychological level and as a broader collective sociological level, have trauma as an active barrier to their voice and storytelling. And finally, as I talked throughout this night about whose stories matter, it's always important to end this emphasizing the social salience of that. Certain voices continue to hold greater authority when being heard, and some stories told by some people do not gain that level of public traction, in particular temporal and geographic spaces like North America. All right, so the way I want to end off tonight is to do a quick reading of a play that I wrote. And before I I have asked some of my friends to read the characters. Before I do that, I do think I should give you a little bit of background on this play. So it's called Telling a Muslim-Canadian History. And it's based off of my experiences working for the city of Edmonton. I was hired by the city as a Muslim history interpreter, particularly for the museum Fort Edmonton Park. There they house Al-Rashid Mosque, which is the first mosque in Canada, built in 1938. So this site holds a lot of personal and familial importance to me. My aunt, who I'm not blood related to, but does live in Vancouver and who I love greatly, her family is one of the founding families of Al-Rashid Mosque. My grandfather, Baha'u'llah, also wrote the first history book on Arab Canadians. It's called An Olive Branch on the Family Tree. And in the process of writing in this book, and also in just being an Arab person and living in Edmonton, Alberta at the time, he became very close and interacted a lot with the community around Al-Rashid. And so, you know, this building and its history has a lot of significance to me and my family, and it's been there kind of as a constant force throughout our lives here in Canada. And so when I'm writing this play, what I really want to probe into is something very similar to what I'm talking about tonight about whose stories matter. I really kind of want to delve into Canadian historiography and why it is that we hear certain histories over others, and a lot of the barriers that I faced in trying to tell Muslim Canadian history. All right, so with that, I'm going to invite my friends to come up and do the cold reading. And then hopefully what I want to do, just as I talked about the importance of dialogue, I'm hoping that I can have a dialogue with them afterwards about their findings in engaging with the script and also with the audience, and we can also open it up to just general questions to me about this presentation and about my work. So, are you guys ready? Okay, wait, I need to give you the mic.
So is this supposed to be an old-timey Catholic church or something?
It can look kind of like a church, yeah. This is Al-Rashid Mosque, so it's actually a mosque, not a church.
What's a mosque?
It's where Muslims go to pray.
Muslims? You mean like the Arabians?
Yes, the original founders of the mosque were Arabs, mostly from Lala, a small town in Lebanon. Just to let you know, though, Arab is an ethnicity and Islam is a religion, so Arab and Muslim are not the same thing. There are lots of Arabs who aren't Muslim and lots of Muslims who aren't Arab.
But the ones that built this place were both.
Yes.
So why is it here? What's its history to Canada?
This is Al-Rashid Mosque, the first purpose-built mosque in Canada. Al-Rashid was built in 1938 by the Edmonton Muslim community. It's a really cool building with an amazingly rich history. Can you believe that the first mosque in Canada was built right here in Edmonton?
Built in 1938. So were there even Muslims here in the 1920s then?
I'm going to just do the stage direction. A spotlight shines on museum attendee 1, isolating them from the rest of the stage, and all the stage lights dim around them.
What I really mean to say is I do not like that there's a Muslim church here. I'm trying to be subtle about it, to be cordial, but really it offends me. The official For Edmonton Park Guide says that it covers history from 1846 to 1929. It does not even fit within the museum's historical dates. It does not fit here. This weird-ass Muslim church is located in the 1920s section of the park, and everything around it is also from the 1920s. But the Muslim church itself is too new. It's from an entirely different decade. It is not a part of this history, and it sticks out like a sore thumb. I don't even think that they can justify any telling of Arab or Muslim history in this park, because I don't even believe that they were even here in the 1920s. And if they were, they probably didn't do anything substantial. Clearly then, this Muslim church is an intrusion on this museum.
Spotlight ends, lights return to menorah.
Muslims were here well before the 1920s, before they built the mosque. Many early Muslims would practice in private and on their own or even in their living rooms. In Islam, it is permissible in the absence of a formal imam, which is like a pastor, for an individual to function as their own imam in prayer. Many adapted their faith practice to live in North America. For example, traditional Friday prayer could be made up for on Sunday if someone had to work Friday.
Well, all that is well and good, but is this really a representative history?
What do you mean by that?
Just that this doesn't really tell the story of Canada, you know? Like, how many people even attended this Muslim church?
Around 200 in the beginning, but the mosque drew in many other Muslim families to Edmonton, and there was a lot of expansion since.
Well, that's about a fraction of 0.5% of all people living in Canada. See, it's just really negligible. It's a wonderful story, but is it really of historical value to Canada when we look at the big picture? I mean, look around at the other museum exhibits. Do cowboys and Muslim churches really go together?
The history of this mosque is not one that just involved the Muslim community. There was active participation and even financial support from many members of the Edmonton Christian and Jewish communities at the time. It is really a story about Edmonton and Canada, and that story involves Muslims.
You know what? I'm supposed to be meeting someone, so I'm going to go.
Museum attendee 1 exits stage left abruptly. Zakaria stares out and then sits down at the picnic table and waits. She pulls out a harmonica and begins to play nursery rhyme songs. After a bit, museum attendee 2 enters stage left.
You play that wonderfully. I could hear you from all the way over there.
Thank you.
So what's this exhibit?
This is Al Rashid Mosque, the first mosque in Canada. This is the original building built in 1938.
Wow, built here in Edmonton?
Yep.
I've lived my entire life here and I didn't even know that. That's so cool.
It is pretty cool, isn't it?
So why is it all construction-y?
I guess it's just a maintenance thing. Hopefully they'll be done soon enough. Then I can show people the inside.
It is just so cool that something like this was here in Edmonton. I mean, it's so different. You don't see a historic mosque every day.
A spotlight shines on museum attendee 2, isolating them from the rest of the stage. All other stage lights dim, aside from that on the spotlight.
Even back then, Canada was so tolerant. Don't you just love that? Canadians like me were so tolerant even back then. I love the idea of ordinary, everyday Canadians, like my uncle, just bumping into a mosque in, like, 1940. Doesn't that just make you chuckle? Like, good old Uncle Joe walking down the road and, oh my gosh, it's a little Muslim mosque in 1940 Edmonton. Just a mosque in the middle of the prairie. And he's just like, yep, that's cool with me.
Spotlight ends, lights return to standard.
So they would worship Muhammad here?
They worship God in Islam. They worship God. In Islam, Muhammad, peace be upon him, was God's final prophet.
Oh, I thought Muhammad, peace be with him, yeah? I thought he was like the Muslim God.
Well, now you know.
Does that tell the history of the mosque?
Yeah, it should. Do you want to read it?
I'd love to. Al Rashid Mosque. Built in 1938, Edmonton Mayor John Fry gave his endorsement for the project and encouraged Edmontonians to see the mosque as a marker of Canadian liberal values and hospitality. The mosque building was designed by Mark Druith, a Ukrainian Christian. It was brought to Fort Edmonton Park in 1991 so that its history could be preserved.
Huh?
Something wrong?
It's just they didn't name a single Arab or Muslim person on that information plaque. Just white dudes.
I guess that is kind of weird.
And it's not like there aren't people worth naming. So many Arab women tirelessly work through grassroots activism to fundraise and campaign to get this mosque built. Women like Rikia Saddi, Hilwi Hamdan, and Mariam Teha.
I'm sure it was a simple mistake.
Yeah.
That is really so cool still. When they finish construction, I'll be sure to come back with all my friends. You think it'll be finished by August?
Hopefully. To be honest, I don't really know for sure, but I really hope so.
Well, I'll be sure to revisit and check. Thanks for the talk. Have a nice day.
Enjoy the rest of the museum. Check out the Indigenous people's experience. It's the coolest exhibit here.
And that's where this excerpt ends. So yeah. So before opening up to the rest of the floor, I guess I'll just ask you guys just on your preliminary thoughts about the script and like how you felt like you engaged with it. Kat, do you want to start? You're just over there.
Of course I know what a mosque is. So, yeah. Oh, it's on still. Okay. Yeah, I feel like yeah, I mean, at least the first museum attendant guy who I was like just straight up with like being racist, whereas like the second guy was like, oh man, like those good old days, they just keep on being good, you know? So that was like, he's just like so clueless and removed from the issue that it's like a cute thing. He can just kind of like pop in, learn about, and then be like, okay, that's enough, bye. So yeah, I don't know, that's my...
The way this was written, it's like very relatable for me because I'm a Muslim person and a Muslim woman specifically, especially when he mentions it at the end of the play. And these are like questions that I would get all the time. Like I would be called Islam or Arab or whatever. And like people assume that those two things are always synonymous. So it was kind of cool to maybe not cool. Cool is probably not the right word. To see it like actually showcased in a way that I'm like, wow, this has happened to me a multitude of times. So yeah, that's kind of how I interacted with it.
I didn't know we'd be asked to.
Sorry, Michael. You don't have to.
No, I've interacted with my character a few times, like working at UBC's own Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center. I've rarely had the first attendee, but people will come in and say, it's so great that, like, you know, there's so much progress. It's so amazing that UBC is taking so many steps, like, which, I mean, I think it is important to recognize good work when it's being done, but there are, like, I've had Indigenous and non-Indigenous people come in or call on the phone who are just, like, so excited and happy to kind of, like, there's, for a variety of reasons, there's definitely a temptation to be like, oh, it's so nice that everything's fixed, and that can be challenging to interact with, as well as like the more overtly hostile attendees. So I definitely resonate with that.
Yeah, I do kind of wish I could show you guys the full play, but I can't. I do kind of look at like this was just kind of a good snippet, I thought, because it showed, I think, two people that I very commonly interacted with in a public engagement capacity. But I also had like those moments where I interacted, and this was showed in the full play, of where I actually got to talk with Muslim attendees who came purposefully to see this mosque and knew the history already and were very excited to see it. And I also had like moments of solidarity where I've interacted with some of the other interpreters, including there was a Métis interpreter that I got very close with, and that was just really touching in how she wanted to engage with Muslim history. So I unfortunately can't show you the full picture, but that was like a pertinent picture that I thought would be really fun for us to at least have a short conversation about. Yeah, there is a lot of problems with Canadian historiography and getting that mosque and having its history told. They did not hire anyone to talk about its history until I was hired. I was one of the first people hired, one of two. Prior to that, they just relied on people who were volunteers from the community, or they just would leave it as a space that would not be interpreted, and they would emphasize other histories over it, even though this building was in that museum and in that park for years, like since the 1990s. All right, I'm happy to open it up to the floor for questions or comments about the play or about my presentation. And y'all can ask questions too.
Well, thank you, Zach. This hit really close to home. I grew up in Edmonton. I've been to Fort Edmonton Park like 6 times. Couldn't tell you that mosque was there. It just is towards the end. You kind of get tired. You see all the houses and all the different avenues. The fort is really cool. But yeah, this So thanks for at least one more person knows about it now. My question is more on the theater side of things, though. I'm wondering if in your research or like even just personally, you have a take on like, let's say, casting it the wrong way. Like the writer writes a male part, but you cast a female person there, or like if their gender identity doesn't match or their race doesn't match or something like that. Like, is that helpful? Does it hurt the story that was trying to come across? Like, where does that fit in, I guess?
So this is actually something I was debating on how much I wanted to talk about and put into this presentation. I did a webinar series, and I hosted a moderated talk on the limits and costs of EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion. And there was a whole part where my panelists really delved into this idea of colorblind casting. So I'm going to first talk about colorblind casting and addressing this question, and then I want to talk about representation in shows and in storytelling. So colorblind casting, for the record, is not representative. It's not a representative way of telling stories. It usually just kind of looks at the human body as like as kind of an abstract form, and it casts people just according to what they see as merit. But what gets absented in that is actually authentic representation of the people on stage. So in colorblind casting processes, you don't actually get to engage with Black storytelling as it would be told by a Black person and Black experiences. You don't get to see queer storytelling as it is told by a queer person and queer experiences. You just have characters who might speak to a general human experience and an actor who's playing that general human experience, and their background is not coming into that character at all. So even if you physically are now seeing someone who is transgender, who is indigenous, who is brown on the stage, on your TV screen, that alone does not make representation. And moreover, when I talked, so in my webinar series, the two artists that I spoke with were vehement about how harmful colorblind casting has been for them and their work as artists. So then on the question of representation, I think there's always an acute awareness that representation does matter. It means something when you're able to see characters that relate to your own experience. And I never want to take that away. But I also don't want to overemphasize this idea of representation. Obviously, I want representation. When I say there's no Palestinian characters on stage in stories about Palestinians, that's harmful. When we're talking about experiences of queer people and you don't actually see queer people involved in that storytelling process, that is harmful because you don't actually get to know those people on their own terms. You don't actually get to engage with them on their own terms. And Deborah Ford, I remember one of the things she was telling me about in this interview, the woman I had quoted earlier, she had talked about in that interview her nephew, who she was reading a story to, just a children's story, and it was related to like the process of combing and working with black hair. And her nephew was suddenly able to engage with the story, and he was so delighted in engaging with the story because it was the first time that he felt seen in a children's story. And she was talking about how that's important to her and her continued work. So obviously, we want to see the representation of people in these spaces. But interestingly, she was also the person that told me, I don't think you don't need to be of any background to tell a story about anyone. I am involved in stories that are about people who are not like me. But this is, of course, in the context of a broader team. This is in the context of, when we're talking about theater, it's like a team of people. And so she's one of many players. So this obviously might look differently if we're talking about a single playwright and just like that standalone work by itself. But the idea of a broader group storytelling does not need to involve like every person personally relating to the experiences of the story being told. But of course, we still want to make sure that there are people that are able to authentically talk about what that means to them and their community.
Hello, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation in the place as well. And then I want to say thank you to the play actors as well.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
I had a question about which story to pick. I'm sure that there are countless stories that haven't been heard, but at the end of the day, in order to put on a play that has finite duration, right? And then that is financially very restricted, right? Usually for those unheard stories. But I was wondering about for instance, it could be your experience, or it could be through your interviews with those playwrights and actors and people. I was wondering what their kind of thought process has been as to which story I was wondering if there are any standards about which story to pick, which story not to pick as well, right? Choosing a story is an active choice, right? As to you think you chose to pick this story as opposed to this particular story. And is there any sort of, I don't know, bias or whatever, or personal significance to it? I haven't really formulated a question per se, but that's something I have been thinking about.
So yeah, it's the problem with theaters, of course, it's a very Western storytelling practice. It's not universal. Of course, there's different theatrical modes throughout the world. There's different ways of spectacle, but obviously the kind of theater I was talking about throughout this presentation is the Western model. And it comes with those high costs, it comes with those finances, and it is a barrier. So it's not an equal access storytelling, say like poetry, which has gained a lot of salience amongst Palestinians, because that's one that you can do across border checkpoints. That's something that, like, and it was also of cultural significance prior to our dispossession. That's something that, like, obviously different communities have different modes and for storytelling. But when we talk about like whose stories get picked, I don't think it always comes from the artistic level. It doesn't come from the artist necessarily. Of course, there's like things in the artist's brain about like how they want to tell the story, and there might be individual psychological processes of how they think about whose story I'm going to tell and how I'm going to tell it. But in terms of that active picking of whose story is going to come forward, I would say it comes from an administrative level, and it comes from those in a capitalist system who stand to make money off of this, who stand to profit. So, you know, when it's the theater company that is putting on the show that's going to have the final say of what story is going to be presented here and what kind of story and what that's going to look like. And like there's different means of how like that's going to look like. So even like at Tisri Dunia Theater, I remember Rahul Varma, and he had his reasonings for this, and I thought, and in many ways I thought it was very powerful, but he would advise most of the artists that worked in his theater to write plays that somehow connected back to Canada. And so even though he was dealing with immigrants and minority artists, the idea of like having a Canadian connection, whether someone who lived in Canada was coming back, or whether like just some kind of tangential connection, was to allow the audience to kind of recognize their own connection to these characters and recognize the humanity. And those were very important artistic visions for him. And also the fact that for him, he didn't see minority Canadian represented on stage. Prior to this time, and he's written about this, the minority theater was one that was just kind of traditional cultural theater of immigrants that had no connection to Canada whatsoever. So you didn't actually see these people in relation to being a part of the diaspora in Canada in the storytelling. And so that was important to him. But still, like, that's a theatrical model, and it's a model for a company that does kind of limit certain storytelling. And he wasn't hardline about this. He didn't say, like, I'm not going to have like immigrant stories from that don't connect to Canada. He did. He had tons of different stories. But you know, that kind of advising, that kind of, it's still kind of, it's an inhibitor of a certain artistic process for some people. And this is not to disparage he is probably, I think, one of the greatest theatrical minds I've ever met. I love his work, and I've read many of his plays. Many of them have made me cry, and his company is, I think, profound, because it's one of the first companies in Canada to really do what it does. But any kind of company is going to have its limits, and there's always going to have those restrictions on story, especially in a model that is known as capitalistic society, where you need to stay afloat.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving such like detailed insights to these questions. Following on, I guess, from what you're sharing about this particular artist, I would love to hear more about what went into the process of creating the story, this particular piece, in mindful of things like who your audience is in relation to the story that you're trying to tell, and who you feel that the story is for, and so on. Like, how did you kind of balance what would have been like the epistemological work that you're trying to do with like this story and with this performance in relation to these like paradigms and structures? You know, like theater is still very much within the context of Western theater, like a very white space when it comes to audiences, as well as when it comes to the people kind of like writing plays and acting, but also to like the audiences in terms of just like attendance and so on. So I was just kind of curious as to how you navigated that.
Are you referring to my own personal artistic process, or are you referring to a particular artist that I interviewed? To mine, like with this play? So I had written this one-act play actually for my undergraduate honors thesis. I had a prof who, she was like a cool prof, you know? She was like, guys, you don't have to write a paper. No. Have fun. Tell a story. And I was like, all right. And apparently I was the first person to ever write a one-act play in that class, so she was very happy. She thought it was cool. The way I kind of wanted to engage with it was because, you know, I had just finished that work that summer, and this was something that was really pertinent on my mind. This play has never been performed. This is the first and most public performance of it, so it's only been for my own personal kind of storytelling for myself, I suppose. It wasn't meant to engage an audience. However, and I also don't want to, I'm hesitant to, just because, there's parts of the story that I'm not sure if I'm ready to engage the public with yet. Another part of the reason why you didn't get to see the full script yet. But in this idea, I agree with you that when we talk about the Western theater, it is epistemologically very white. But I think some of the reasons why people like Rahul Varma, once coming as a diaspora person and coming to Canada, engaging with this storytelling process, is that because it's so community driven, because you're working with so many people, it can be really profound and meaningful to the individual person, because unlike other artistic mediums, which are much more individualistic, like with painting or with writing a poem or with writing a traditional narrative, like in a short story format, this is one that requires the active participation of multiple players. And because it's a format that is familiar to the Western theater goer, it's familiar to Western people, it can be very profound for the artist to engage with this kind of community-driven process. And so that's kind of, I think, the quintessential part of theater that adds to this idea of social mobilization and political salience, is that it's rooted in community. You need people to come, you need people to be involved, you need so many people. And so it's a people-oriented artistic structure. I would also actually quickly like to add, in this aspect, because it's so people-oriented, it gives more room for challenging of like system justification. It gives more room for challenging colonial constructs, colonial ways of thinking. I've been engaged with many theatrical artists who are of Indigenous background and who have actively tried to talk about ways of changing the way we think about storytelling, such that it advances, a decolonial model.
Great. Hi, Zach. Thanks very much for your just kind of sharing your heart and your research, and to all of us. I think, quite similarly to Lindsay's question as well. I'm definitely not much in my knowledge of theater isn't very strong, but I came across this concept of kind of I don't know if it's Augusto Boal, like a Brazilian playwright, who talks about this kind of theater of the oppressed, or like forum theater, and a way in which kind of audience members are somewhat spect actors in a way, and kind of I've seen instances where audience members kind of see injustice play out, and they're kind of able to like step in and say, hold on, wait, and like are able to maybe even allow for like dialogue within like that moment. And I was wondering if you had ever like come across things like that in the theaters and plays that you've worked with, where audience members are like generally like really not just kind of passive and just kind of invited to take it all in, but are invited into the grander kind of narrative that you're thinking of, and perhaps ways in which the works that you produce or the plays that you've been a part of, how would you like to perhaps use that medium in a different way, or if there's any opportunities for audience members to kind of then get involved, or how you like that to resonate into their kind of day-to-day. Sorry, not very articulated, but hopefully that made sense in a way.
Yeah, so the theater actually does have a bit of a history with this idea of, I suppose, protest. So there is, of course, to talk about Europe first. There was the idea of the problem play that emerged in Russia, and so I think it was Russia, somewhere in Europe. And so the problem play was a particular model that was really supposed to capture the modern day social issues that are plaguing a nation in a realistic setting. So it was really about theatrical realism and depicting the everyday as one sees it, but really showing the social problems at hand. But I'm also very familiar with this idea of theater of the oppressed, and there has been a lot of theatrical movements by marginalized people to kind of, to build their community, and that's to kind of bring people together and to kind of show their humanity and have something to come together and wake up to and do every day, but also to really kind of push their story and make sure that they're being heard on their terms. The company that comes to mind that kind of reminds me that is a form of this theater of the oppressed is the Freedom Theater, which is a Palestinian-based theater that comes out of the West Bank. Unfortunately, the founder of that theater, Giuliano Milchamis, was assassinated in conjunction with the work that he was doing with that theater. So it's, of course, in talking about theater of the oppressed and that kind of storytelling, I really do think that, making your voice heard is an actively dangerous process, especially for the most marginalized people. It puts a target on your back, and it's not the first time that I've heard of marginalized artists, Palestinian or not, being harmed or targeted in certain ways. So yeah, there's a plethora of examples of people who have kind of thought about theater in this way that kind of engage with people one-on-one to really advance new ways of thinking and to really try to challenge the status quo. In my own personal work, I did a radio play over COVID. It was originally going to be like an actual production, but then COVID. So in that it was really important to me that that show involved the talkback. That included like some of my actors, the original playwright of the show, who is Rahul Varma, and engaged in a dialogue and a discussion to try to distill ideas of the play, but also to connect it to other world issues. The play that I put on was called State of Denial, and it was about the Armenian genocide and the Rwandan genocide and kind of in conversation with each other. But we used that to talk about Uyghurs and to talk about Black Lives Matter and to kind of connect it into other world issues that we're seeing, and to also talk about the complicity that people today still have in upholding intergenerational trauma for survivors of genocide, even if we're not aware of it.
Hey, Zach. If you have nothing much else to do, like me, you can come to everything in the Coach House, which means that I know that this is the third week in a row when we've had a presentation here about theatre, social justice. There was a panel in the first week. Colleen was speaking about Rage and Love last week, and the week after next we've got Amirissa, the rapper, coming. So this show is getting on the road. The one thing I wanted to probe a little with you, because I think you've been very skillfully just setting it up for us, but just setting it a little aside. When you quoted some of your interview subjects, you summarized them as saying, they want to make people think for the first time or think again. There was a lot of thinking going on. And in the excerpt you showed us, which you also explained, is only a bit of this play, and there's some of it that you're not ready to put on yet here, maybe. We've got the two attendees who are clearly, they're going to think a bit more after they walk away. But then you slipped in a mention about a play that you saw or something that happened in the theatre that made you cry. And we were tipping over then into another register that is the one we don't usually go to in the Coach House between 8 and 9 because we don't want people weeping or howling, or there's a kind of hygiene that we apply and observe. Colleen talked a bit about that last week, and how, in fact, theatre does not observe that hygiene very far. That it's more than about thinking, it's about feeling really rather strongly, and whatever the audience is, putting them at that kind of risk of possibility, of feeling that wouldn't otherwise supervene in their lives. I'm not asking you to create any kind of cathartic moment for us here. That old European, or was he an ancient theorist, Aristotle, had this theory about pity and fear and how good it was to feel those sometimes, under certain conditions, to extremes. The theatre providing those conditions, providing, in a sense, a safe place for feelings that are anything but safe, if not, somehow artistically managed. Your thoughts on observing that line,
yeah.
and how and when to cross it, and how soon we could do more of that here, safely?
I certainly agree that, storytelling in general, not just theater, it's meant to be an emotive process. I think it's hard to engage in a story where you don't have feelings in one way or another, whether that's a connection to a character or whether that's a frustration with what's happening to the characters. It is a process that's meant to truly connect to a human register. And I've worked with artists, and they've kind of talked about really wanting to show the humanity of certain subjects and how people engage with the topics and how people engage with the play. The reason I didn't want to particularly emphasize this kind of emotive process in theatrical storytelling is that sometimes I do worry that can venture into a more essentialist idea of humanity and the humanism of it. I'm not saying that's necessarily what you were getting at, but that's a personal thing that I've noticed with some of the artists I've talked to. When they talk about the emotional aspects of their play, it's usually, the most that usually comes of it is kind of talking about how people realize, oh, they're just like humans like me, and I can relate to those stories, and I can relate to those experiences and that sadness. But sometimes I just worry that if we don't involve challenge and critical thought, we stop there, and that's where we leave it. We leave it at, I can relate to that sadness. Of course, that doesn't just end there. There's also a basis, and I even talked about it myself, in which solidarity is built, in which you see something that happens to someone on stage, and even though it's not your experience, it's not something as personally afflicted you recognize the patterns and things that have happened to you, and that can build a stronger basis for solidarity work, for recognizing not just each other's humanities, but the basis in which we need to achieve justice together. So there's a dual side to this idea of emotiveness in theater and how it can be impactful or unimpactful.
It's past 9, but we started like 5 minutes late, so I'll maybe take one last question if there's one. If not, yeah, we'll end here. Thank you so much, Zach.